Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several advances in favor of the Russians and a single one in favor of the Ukrainians. The Russians have managed to advance within Chasiv Yar in the northern parts of the Donetsk region. They've also managed to advance west of Pokrovsk within the central parts of the Donetsk region. There are several advances in the northern flank of Kurakhove, a single advance within the settlement of Kurakhove, as well as an advance in the southern flank of Kurakhove. The Ukrainians managed to reconquer some positions in this direction as well in the village of Kostantino. Starting out in the southern flank of Kurakhove, the Ukrainians managed to recapture Kostantino, re-secure the settlement. The Russians previously managed to gain a foothold within the eastern parts of the settlement, capturing most of the southern parts. The Ukrainians have now counterattacked to regain positions here within the settlements and push the Russians back out. This was mainly done from the roads connecting to the north through Yantarne, down through Hihant, and then into Kostantino, where the Ukrainians have the final remaining supply line that is secure for them here in the west of Kostantino. There's an additional one here near Uspenivka, directly to the west north of Kostantino. In the eastern direction, the Russians have physically cut the road west of Hanivka, encircling the Ukrainian forces within the settlement. With this assault, the Russians are now present and have a foothold within the settlement itself of Uspenivka, to which the Ukrainians no longer have any supply lines in or out of Hanivka, putting it in a complete encirclement. We're seeing such complete encirclements happening more often now than we have seen since the start of the war. In addition to this, there's also the one south of Kurakhove in the apartment complex area where there is a physical encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. The Russians have also slowly started advancing west of it to move towards the road connecting Kurakhove itself down south towards Edelnya, where they will have an additional road connected to their forces. The Russians will then slowly move along the outskirts of the settlement towards the western outskirts of it. Therefore, we see the main focus of the Russians near Kurakhove and in the southern outskirts of it is to gain control over the pockets south of Kurakhove, both the operationally encircled areas and the physically encircled areas. The Ukrainians are attempting to secure their positions further, regain some positions, and prevent a Russian breakthrough in the area. In the northern flank of Kurakhove, there are several advances by the Russians. The Russians started pushing west of Staryterne towards Shevchenko, where they've managed to reach the fortified positions on the eastern outskirts of Shevchenko, where fighting is currently taking place. This also expands the area in which the Ukrainian forces are cut off from supplies in between Sonsivka and Staryterne. But there's this interesting development, which is the Russians now have full control over the northern and southern flanks of the forest areas. There is the Solona River in the western direction, but the forest lines actually end right here. And considering the forest lines end, that means the process through from the forest line here in the eastern parts towards the ones in the western parts is a fairly wide area and a river line in the middle. Specifically, the shortest distance is about 600 meters from one forest patch to another. This means that the Ukrainians, either resupplying or withdrawing from this area, would have to move through 600 meters fully exposed in the open field and have to walk through a river line. This makes it extremely difficult to resupply their forces in the pocket or for their forces to withdraw from the pocket. This means that the Ukrainian forces in this pocket are in an extremely critical position, and they will likely be physically encircled as well. The Russians also managed to advance in the northern direction, where they are slowly closing the pocket, pushing the Ukrainian forces further back from the settlement of Voznesenka and away from Sonsivka. The Russians have fully secured the settlement of Sonsivka, to which they are now capable of launching offensive operations in the western or southern directions to further pressure the Ukrainian forces in the area. The Ukrainian forces operating this far deep into the Russian lines is very difficult and doesn't make a lot of sense. It is a mission that has very low possibility of success and doesn't have a lot of rewards if it succeeds, whether it is to recapture Voznesenka or whichever it is. There are several supply lines going to this section of the front line. Even if one is cut off, the others will be fine. It seems that the Ukrainians generally don't communicate that well whether they retreat or hold on to their positions, considering that several encirclements have happened over the past few days, both in Hanivka, south of Kurakhove, and now also here in between Staryatony and Sivka. This indicates that the communication within the Ukrainian lines is not that good, or that some groups are withdrawing without reporting it to the frontline units, which ends up exposing the flanks to these and allows encirclements of them. The Russians have also managed to capture the settlement of Surya, the remaining parts of it. With this, the Russians have full control of the settlement, which will allow them to develop offensive operations towards Slovyanka, Petrupavlivka, or generally west of the three settlements of Staryatony, Sonsivka, and Surya, where they'll look to gain control over the next three settlements and connect with the highway connecting Pokrovsk in the north with Kurakhove and Velika Novosilka in the south. The Russians also managed to advance west of Novotoretsk. Following the full capture of the settlements, they're now moving in the direction of Novovasilivka, and to strengthen the highway between Pokrovsk in the north with Kurakhove and Velika Novosilka in the south, through the capture of the first line in the flank of it, which will allow the Russians to move further along the highway towards Novolenivka, storming the settlement, as well as to hide over the fortified positions from their weak spot, flanking them from the rear, or to develop further offensive operations along the village agglomeration west of Novotoretsk with hardly any Ukrainian fortified positions in the area, to move upwards towards the railways and supply lines in and out of Pokrovsk itself from the Dnipro region. In the Toretsk direction, we also see that there is really no developments over the past 24 hours, but the full capture of the industrial area was the results of yet another physical encirclement of Ukrainian forces, which, in line with the topic of this video, is happening more and more often. In the Chasiv Yar direction, the Russians have also managed to capture the remaining parts of the industrial area there, and with this, the Russian fight will now happen over the apartment complex area in the central parts of the city, and this actually marks the beginning of the end of Chasiv Yar, similar to the city of Krasnoyarivka in the southwestern flank of Donetsk. Once the Russians captured the industrial zone in the central parts of the city, it was the beginning of the end of the control over the city, because the Ukrainians were at that point unable to hold on to the defensive positions for much longer, and the Russians managed to capture the entire area fairly quickly. And with this, the situation is very similar in Chasiv Yar. Now that they've lost the industrial zone, the Russians have a very strong foothold within the city, and will be able to concentrate a lot more forces within the city to launch further offensive operations in the area. And with the artillery support, air support, and drone support for their forces, the Russians will be able to develop offensive operations in all directions from Chasiv Yar towards the surrounding fortified possessions and settlements of the Ukrainians. We are also seeing a similar situation within Toretsk, where the Russians, with control of the industrial area and the central apartment complex area, the beginning of the end of the Ukrainian control over the city has also begun. The current situation is that the clock is ticking for the Ukrainian control over Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Kurakhove, and Velika Novosilka, where the Russians are storming the flanks of these settlements, capturing the important fortified positions within these settlements, and is slowly advancing through them to gain full control of them, and the situation is practically irreversible for the Ukrainian forces. In the direction of Pokrovsk, the offensive is just beginning. However, if the Russians gain control over all of these four settlements, Velika Novosilka, Kurakhove, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar, the Russian offensive near Pokrovsk can concentrate a lot more forces in this direction, and it will threaten the defenses of the Ukrainians near Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, which is the main defensive line of the Ukrainians, but also allow the Russians to facilitate offensive operations within the Dnipro region, whether to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhzhia region, or to move towards the city of Dnipro itself, or to flank the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line in the east. Either of these cases will be possible with a Russian capture over Pokrovsk, and even without a Russian capture over Pokrovsk, the Russian capture of Velika Novosilka and Kurakhove will allow for the Russians to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, to allow them to launch offensive operations towards Huliaipole and Orehiv in the south. For every contingent of Ukrainian forces that gets encircled across the front line, it becomes more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold a stable front line. They'll need additional reinforcements to be sent to the front, which will diminish any offensive capabilities the Ukrainians have, because they would have to balance between offensive operations and defensive operations, considering the fact that it is reported that the Ukrainians are taking more losses at a faster pace than they are mobilizing their new soldiers. And the new soldiers also have to go through training, and this makes it difficult for a continuous supply of new forces. And they are forced to speed up the training period, so the quality lags, and the more the quality lags, the faster they'll lose more soldiers, and eventually it goes further down the drain into an endless hole where new soldiers do not get necessary training, which ends up causing losses fairly quickly, which then requires new soldiers, and this cycle continues until the Ukrainians are unable to defend the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.